Hi there, my name is Karen, and today we are going to be discussing Neolithic and early dynastic China. As was the case with my other two ancient civilization videos, we're going to be stopping our story at 2000 BC. It probably would have made more sense to completely cover Neolithic, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou, and then pause at 221 BC, which is with the Qin dynasty, which didn't last very long, but it's very impactful. That probably would have been the natural place to start with ancient China, but because I'm kind of making the series within the context of wanting to put everyone co-contemporaneously so we can see where everyone is at different geographic locations at the same time period, we're stopping maybe a little earlier than what would be natural. But that said, I still think there is a whole lot to say about China that gets us from 10,000, the Neolithic Revolution, through to 2000 BC. It's 8,000 years of history. Lots of things happened for the Chinese people. And I think most interestingly, this video can make a really good exploration into the stories we tell ourselves about our past and how much of that actually bears out in the archaeological record. Because China is a very great example of, they have these really fantastic myths and pseudo-historical characters. And the question becomes, were these people based on real people, or is there a grander story to tell about Chinese civilization that goes beyond just the Central Plains and the Yellow River Valley, which is sort of the story that historians and archaeologists have been telling for quite a long time. This video is seeking to be a general walk through Chinese history through 2000 BC. I am going to freely admit to you here, I am not an expert on Chinese history. It's probably one of my weaker areas, so I apologize in advance for poor pronunciation. I have tried to look up the pinyin system, and I've done my best to Google pronunciations before I spew them out to you here, just so you know. If it's a Q, it is a Ch. So what looks like the Qin dynasty is the Qin dynasty. And then for a X, you're going to get a Sh. So the first dynasty is XIA, and that's the Xia. And then C is kind of pronounced like a Ts. That's it. I've learned a lot researching this video, so I hope you enjoy it and I hope it is informative. So Chinese history at its most basic form is the story of the rise and fall of dynasties. Each dynasty passed from optimistic beginnings, sort of a stagnation period, decline, and then a new dynasty coming in and taking over what is referred to as the Mandate of Heaven. The Mandate originates with the second dynasty of China, the Shang dynasty, and it is the belief that a dynasty has a special ability to communicate with the ancestors and the spirits of the past. The purpose of the Mandate of Heaven is to communicate with the ancestors freely and then to use the knowledge that you acquire from the ancestors to rule China effectively and fairly. If a family were to stop doing that, then the ancestors would punish them by taking away the Mandate of Heaven and giving it to some other family, which is kind of the way you can explain why dynasties change and the acceptance of dynastic change. They're able to kind of dress it up in this Mandate of Heaven. When immoral behavior or hard times come, a dynasty is at real threat of losing their control over China because some other warlord, feudal state, noble type person might want to raise an army, come in, take over, and say that the ancestors told them that that was what they should do. So the only dynasty, though, that we are going to be looking at today, and this is just barely getting us to 2000, because the Xia began in 2070 and go to about 1600 BC, which is kind of inching me a little further from my 2000 cutoff that I was looking for. But I still think that since they are a potentially not real dynasty, the theme that I'm going with here is a lot more about how China has perceived its past versus what is archaeologically being borne out. I think it's really important to cover the Xia in that context because the Shang, there's lots of evidence for. We know they really existed. We have an idea of what they got up to. So when we meet up again next time we visit China, the Shang and the Zhou and then the Qin is going to be a great video to make, and it's going to be based on a lot of solid historical reference. Whereas with the Xia, we're a little bit more in the dark. What I'm getting at here is that there's sort of this crux of early Chinese history. There's sort of two versions of it. And one is part myth and a major source of bias within the Chinese historic and archaeological community. And I don't want to say like every archaeologist or historian that is Chinese or works in China is biased by this, but just the general mood of the Chinese government, is to stick with this story. And so there is internal pressure, I believe, to make this the story that we are telling about early Chinese history. Version 1, we're in the Yellow River Valley, and it's possible to trace many aspects of Chinese culture to the Yellow River Valley, Pyeonggang and the Yangshao people of the Central Plains. And so this is the story. The Middle Kingdom, which is what we also call China, develops from these Neolithic farmers, and they are the people who invented Chinese everything. And they are the people who defended that culture from invading barbarians and nomads, and then conquered outward and civilized those barbarians and nomads, and ultimately exercised on them the improving benefits of civilization, which bears asking the question, can it really be assumed that Chinese culture began in the Yellow River Valley wholesale and then spread out from this core to dominate the area that we today call China? And here's the second version of early Chinese history. The story is not so simple. There is a bias to say that Chinese culture originated with their geographic lineage, which is specifically to say the Central Plains and the Yellow River floodplain. This would be neglecting the contributions of the people groups who live along the Yangtze River, or say further north in China, such as the Manchurian people. There were dozens of Neolithic people groups in ancient China, and the Central Plains was really just one region of them. How these Central Plains people interacted and traded and culturally combined with these other people groups is a far more interesting story than saying that Chinese culture simply originated from one specific spot, coming out wholesale, this is it. How these Central Plains people interacted with other Neolithic groups over the course of several thousands of years greatly influenced ideas, religious practices, and ways of life that would come to be known as Chinese culture. But to say that it emerged wholesale from the Central Plains is not backed up by the archaeological record. Which means I would like to take a four-pronged approach to this video. First, let's take a look at China's geography. And second, a very, very quick outline of sort of what the natural course of this video would be otherwise, which is let's start with the Neolithic people, make our way up to the Qin so we can kind of get a feel for what this time span that we're looking at is like. I'll need to mention the Shang and the Zhou a certain amount, so it's best to get a grasp of where the story is headed. Third, I would like to examine sort of that myth-filled origin that for a long time was widely accepted. It is now obviously coming under a certain amount of questioning because there's just a fair amount of archaeological evidence that can't be ignored. But let's look at what the original thought process was, and even maybe still what is culturally accepted as what really happened. Because it would not be uncommon for a Han Chinese person to view themselves as a cultural descendant from the Yellow Emperor, who probably didn't exist. And then fourth, I'd like to go over what the archaeological record does truly bear out and what that tells us about the Neolithic through Xia Chinese people. The geographic boundaries of China include deserts and jungles and just huge obstacles. China has a comparatively very flat interior with rivers, and it allowed for several different people groups and populations to grow up in different river valleys. And like Egypt and Mesopotamia, agriculture developed within these valleys. In China, the Yellow River or Hanghe River and the Yangtze represent the north-south divide. The flat interior helps effective administrative states have control over a huge amount of territory. North China is relatively dry and cool. Their climate makes it so that they're excellent for growing soybeans, millet, wheat, barley, but it only has a growing season of about 6 months. This required irrigation, which meant that Yellow River Valley peoples had to come together for public works projects pretty early on. They needed to build irrigation ditches and dikes in order to control the Yellow River. The Yellow River is the 6th longest river in the world at 3,400 miles long, and many dynasties have placed their capital at its mouth. So we're talking about the Shang, the Zhou, the Han, and the Tang. And it is also called China's sorrow because when it floods, it's not a good time for anyone. So even though people have over time done their best to build dikes to contain the water, the river sometimes still does burst through, and that leads to just really huge devastation. In 1887, nearly 1 million people were killed when the dikes broke. The built up silt in the Yellow River can also periodically change its course. It did so twice during the Neolithic period. And what this means for archaeologists is that they have to look for civilizations along what used to be the Yellow River's path, not just what it currently is. South China is a place of heavier rainfall. It gets like 60 inches a year. Their climate and soil makes it very suitable for rice agriculture. And due to that heavy rainfall, sometimes they can get as many as 3 harvests a year. In contrast to the Yellow River, the Yangtze is a navigable river. It is sometimes cheaper and easier to use the river for navigation than it is to build roads or land infrastructure. Roadways were far less necessary. It is about 3,900 miles long, and it is the 3rd longest river in the world. The floodplain of the Yangtze receives a substantial amount of rainfall. It also has a fair number of tributaries. They still don't necessarily flood destructively that often, but it also still does occasionally happen, sometimes with even more devastating effects than what you would see from the Yellow River. In 1931, nearly 4 million people were killed when the Yangtze River was flooded. For whatever reason, the South never achieved the same political dominance as the North. And in times of trouble, this kind of North-South divide is the fault line on which unity kind of stayed together or didn't. Modern China is about 3,400 miles from north to south, and then from east to west, it's about 3,100 miles. This is a simply huge location. And by the second dynasty with the Shang, it was something like 480,000 square miles. So if you're looking to compare that to something like ancient Egypt, the Nile River Valley, which was the populated portion of the country, was about 10,000 square miles. And then if you wanted to go with what they had expeditionary control over, you're looking at something more along the lines of 280,000 square miles. The Shang have double the territory that they're dealing with. Despite the huge territory that was China, it was not unified into what we think of as modern China until much, much later, really almost the modern period. And when we're looking at China, you need to be thinking that there are multiple exterior states that are around kind of the central Middle Kingdom Chinese state. Sometimes within that Chinese state, you're going to have warring and feudal groups. Oftentimes, there maybe were 2 coexisting dynasties, or as one dynasty was falling, another one was growing in power. Because of those aforementioned natural borders and boundaries, China was relatively isolated from kind of the rest of the globalizing ancient world. To the west, you're going to have the plateau of Tibet. You're going to have the Taklamakan and Gobi deserts. And then to the north, you're going to have grasslands, which are home to nomadic, they weren't always raiders, but nomadic peoples who sometimes raided south. Then to the south, you have jungle, which was sort of more of a semi-permeable barrier, which probably explains why Southeast Asia has a lot more of a Chinese influence in communication. Obviously, to the east, it's pretty much just the Korean peninsula. Indian culture reached China intermittently, and it really wasn't until the Silk Road was up, running, and maintained that was a constant and continuous connection. The modern ethnic makeup of China is 90% Han Chinese, and there are 55 other ethnic groups that are involved in there too. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, how big can these ethnic groups be? Well, specifically the Zhang, the Hui, the Uyghurs, the Miao, and the Manchus, they all have populations of over 10 million people. So they're pretty significant people groups. The origins of territorial unity lie with the Han and their agriculture, their dynastic governments, and their ability to just spread throughout the land. So for the sake of ease, let's go over a little bit of history so that we kind of get the feel for Neolithic to Xia to Shang to Zhou to Qin. Neolithic villages began developing along the Yellow River and the Yangtze River and other areas throughout modern-day China. These villages were based around agriculture. The increased amount of food allowed for people to specialize in skills such as pottery, metallurgy, and defense, which increased their wealth. Not the defense, but the metallurgy and the pottery certainly did. And these villages grew in size as their populations grew, and also began to have centralized sort of states start to form out of networks of many different villages, with perhaps one town or village growing in size and importance. Increased wealth led to increased trading, or just general warfare. And so the need for organized physical defenses came, be it through moats and walls or through armies. The second millennia is referred to the time of 10,000 states, which is when several states were warring with each other in order to gain dominance over the region. The first three dynasties, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou, might have existed somewhat contemporaneously to each other. They rose and fell in importance from somewhere around 2000 BC to 221 BC. The first dynasty, the Xia, according to traditional history, was founded by Emperor Yu, and he enacted the hereditary passing of the crown from father to son. So primogeniture is said to have begun here. There were 14 Xia rulers, but many historians and archaeologists believe the Xia were either fictional or just one of many states that existed at the time. Historic dates given for the Xia dynasty is 2070 to 1600 BC. The Shang ruled from 1600 to 1045 BC. We do have historical evidence for the Shang. It is said that they were founded by King Tang, who defeated a Xia tyrant, Ji. The surviving records of this period include bronze weapons, bows, royal tombs, and oracle bones with writing on them. The dynasty came to an end when Dai Xia was defeated by King Wu of the Zhou. The Zhou dynasty ruled from 1046 to 221 BC, and for much of this time, the rule of the Zhou had over the surrounding states was sort of nominal. There were many lords and many states that were basically independent. And then there are two periods of the Zhou, the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou. This is not geographic. The Western Zhou is just the prosperous, united version. And then the Eastern Zhou is when the Zhou lost control over a lot of the region and there started to become more warfare. It was during this kind of Eastern Zhou period that you have individuals like Sun Tzu and Confucius show up who have some really interesting ideas about how military campaigns should be run, how government should be run, the people's relationship to government, the people's relationship to each other, what makes a good government. And that's a whole video right there, which is ancient Chinese thought, which probably when we circle back to China, when we get through a bunch of other stuff first, when we're covering kind of this Shang, Zhou, Qing period, we'll probably do a separate video, which is ancient Chinese thought. The Warring State period ended in 221 BC when it was united by the Qin Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, and he was bureaucratic and obsessed with central planning. He standardized pretty much as he could, from coinage to axle widths to road widths. The Qin dynasty only lasted for about 15 years, so not long, but during that time, he did quite a bit to effectively standardize quite a few things that led for better and easier administrative control throughout the next few dynasties. So short but mighty, the Qin, and also he's the one with the terracotta army. The Qin only ruled for about 15 years before they were overthrown by the Han. Qin Shi Huangdi's heirs were overthrown in uprisings, and then the first part of the Han dynasty represents a real golden age in Chinese history. So from that outline, let's start talking about the mythologized beginnings of Chinese history. Early Chinese history is filled with characters that are semi-historic, is probably the best way to refer to them, but also can sort of become more like a cultural folk hero. There's this fellow Anderson who has imagined communities as his kind of big philosophical nationalism piece. And sometimes the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from and what our cultural identity is, sometimes these stories are just as important as what the real history was. It is worth investigating what these mythologized beginnings of China were and whether or not the people and archaeologists and historians actually truly believe these things is slightly secondary to whether or not there is a belief of what they represent. But what ultimately they can tell us is quite a bit about how the Chinese perceive the beginning of their state. The first kind of set of people are these kind of three august ones, or the three sovereigns. And they were said to have existed starting somewhere around 2900 BC. The overall picture they paint of Chinese cultural beginnings and pre-dynastic is kind of this chain that went unbroken from Central Plains people groups in the Neolithic period to the Xia, to the Shang, to the Zhou, to the Qin, to the Han. And you see kind of this unbroken chain of China's dynastic period from the strong central state in the Central Plains period that grew outward. First, we're gonna have Fuji and Nua, who is either his sister or his wife, or both. This could be getting a little Egyptian in here, I don't know. And they are the first beings, and then they also create human beings. And what they are going to teach them are hunting and fishing. And they have these like sort of serpent bodies. And from them comes Surin, who is known for introducing fire and cooking to the people, and is followed by Shinong, who taught people how to plow and harvest, and he is the father of herbal medicine. So this kind of does make sense when you think about the natural progression of human beings. So we're starting with hunter-gatherer, we're getting to more complex cooking, and then we're getting to agriculture. So it does follow the proper pattern. And then from these three august ones, we're getting into what are called the 5 emperors. From Shinong, we get to Hongdi. That's the Yellow Emperor who ruled around 2700. He's the first proto-dynasty in which kind of the basic principles of government are established, and he is said to have invented the calendar, the imperial crown. He figures out how to do silk, and his people invent the writing system. Hongdi was followed by Zhanshu, and he's the one who told the gods that we need some separation between the heavens and the earth. All this going up and down between spirits and people is not good, so we need it to be separated, and you need to just be talking to one family at a time so that proper order can exist between heavens and earth, with obviously the emperor as the intermediary. Afterwards, we're going to have Daiku, and he is said to have traveled the realm on his dragon, playing some musical instruments. Cool. And I'm sure there are like great stories about him, but for purposes of this, he traveled around the realms on his dragon and played a flute. And then next we have Yao, who developed the solar and lunar calendars, one that has 366 days and a leap month. He establishes the hierarchical system of a central government. During his reign, we've got this myth of Hou Yi, who is going to shoot down 9 of the 10 sons, and then the rooster has to convince the sun to come out of hiding after she's afraid, because she's the last son, that she's going to get shot. There's some historical evidence that maybe there was a really bad drought at that time, which might be related to the myth of the 10 sons. And then the last of the 5 emperors is Shun, and he dealt with the Great Flood. He began as a humble farmer, and Emperor Yao was looking for a successor. This initial idea that the throne is not always passed based on father to son, but on a meritocracy, which also sort of leads to some credence of this idea that a dynasty, once they start behaving immorally and are no longer meritorious of the throne, should no longer have the throne. So there are these really interesting, and this is in Confucianism too, that relationships and what we owe each other are very, very important to the Chinese system, that you do have to merit what you receive from good behavior, and that there are these systems of you are good to me as your lower, and I am good to you as my superior. And when we are all obeying that system correctly, things go well. But when you stop obeying that system, and specifically when a dynasty or an emperor is no longer looking for the best interest of the Chinese people, when he is neglecting his duties to them as a father would his son, then he's no longer meritorious of the throne. So the flood problem continues to be a problem for Shun, but he does organize China into these 12 different provinces. He creates a series of dikes to hold the waters of the flood in check, but it doesn't work, which leads us to the first emperor of the Xia, which is Yu. Yu marks the line between China's more ancient myth type thing and then maybe what's more real with the Xia. It still might be a legend, but the Xia were said to have ruled from the 3rd millennia into the 2nd millennia, and Yu was tasked to solve the problem of the floods. So instead of building dikes, he decides to dig canals, and this works. But it takes 15 years for him to do this. He neglects his family, but he's out there with the common laborers, digging away, trying to get rid of this flood problem. And he meritoriously gains the crown, just like Shun did before him. You would think that we would continue this pattern of merit, but we don't, because the guy who is supposed to get the throne from Yu, whose name is Gao Yao, he dies. So he's the advisor, he's the one who would merit it, he dies. So he doesn't get it, but Yu's son does. And so we have primogeniture, we have father to son, that the crown is going. Interestingly, with Chinese dynasties, it doesn't always go father to son. Sometimes it goes from father, and then you're going to go to his brother, and then his brother, and then it'll revert to the oldest brother's oldest son. You know, people didn't live that long, so you had a good shot of getting it, even if your uncle and then your next uncle got the throne. Everyone's dying at 40. After you, we have Qi, and he takes the throne, and we have the hereditary succession, the Xia dynasty, and the rule of the Xia ends with their last ruler, Qi, who is overthrown by the Shang because apparently he's horrible, and Tang leads an uprising against the Xia in 1600 and establishes the Shang dynasty. And that's the maybe possibly true story that we tell, but that's not the story we're going with. We're going with the story of Stone Age people now, Paleolithic through the Neolithic. This is a lot of history. Buckle up. This is what the archaeological record tells us. So the archaeological reference, probably pretty obviously, tells us something a bit more complicated than what we get from myth and legend. But also as a general tale, what this story gives us is it ascribes pretty much all credit for anything that was created by the Chinese. So we're talking about calendars, writing systems, silk, all of it. It's all accredited to peoples that would have come from the Central Plains region. So let's start kind of at the very beginning, the very, very beginning, what we know of the Paleolithic era. So some of the earliest evidence we have is something called the Peking Man. And you've maybe heard of this. It's 40 Homo erectus skeletons. Homo erectus is genetically a dead end. What was once thought of as the Chinese were all descended from Homo erectus instead of Homo sapiens, that's not what the genetic records are bearing out. So that's a genetic dead end. Homo sapien probably left Africa somewhere around 100,000 years ago. He potentially took two routes. So you have a northern route, which is going to go up through Eurasia, and then you're going to go over into Siberia and then down into northern China. And then the other route would be taking kind of this southern route, which is going to go through Southeast Asia and then up into southern China, probably staying relatively close to the waterline because during the Ice Age, it was cold and it was better to stay near oceans because that was a reliable source of food. So Homo sapiens probably did meet Homo erectus at some point and maybe share a little genetic DNA with each other, much in the same way that Homo sapiens that went up into Europe, where there were Neanderthals, they probably also shared a little DNA. That does not mean that anyone is more than, what, like 2%, something along those lines of Neanderthal or Homo erectus. Everyone's just a Homo sapien today. By the time agriculture gets started, we're at the end of the Ice Age. It's 10,000 BC. Everyone's ready for things to warm up and have a hot girl Holocene. Between 8,000 and 3,000 BC, China is going to be much warmer and much moister than it is today. And northern China and southern Manchuria had these like really great forests. There were grasslands. It was a really marked difference. So these early farmers that are going to be beginning to cultivate millet and barley and wheat, they are dealing with a much easier location for growing that even than what they would have met a little bit later. Rice was probably the first cereal grain that was domesticated in the south, somewhere between 10,000 and 7,500 BC, and then probably millet was the second one, which was going to have a lot of success in the north. Agriculture is harder than hunting and gathering, and so something you do need to ask yourself is, why is it that a society is moving away from hunting and gathering into the more time-consuming, high-effort agriculture? And the theory for why this transition occurred when it did is that not as many infants and young children were dying. Probably people were living a hair bit longer, and probably birth rates were up. And between all of those factors, that meant that populations were really expanding. And there are limits to how large a hunter-gatherer community can be. If it gets too large, it can't support itself. So what do you do if you can't gather enough natural resources, if you can't hunt enough? It puts pressure on to figure out some other way to feed your people. And that's when you turn to agriculture. And agriculture isn't going to take up 100% of their diet right away. It's more like 50% of their diet is millet, and then the other 50% is going to be what they can get from hunting and fishing, and then whatever they can gather. Pelegang culture on the Yellow River, which is in the north, has some evidence through about 5,000 BC, and then they had foxtail millet and that was their staple crop. They left behind these really lovely turquoise ornaments and their burials and the 7-holed flute and some turtle shells, which interestingly, this may not be related at all, but the Shang do a lot of their sort of divination using turtle shells. And this is 6,000 years before the Shang. So is it a coincidence that they're doing these turtle shell things? Or, is it connected? Is this an early precursor to a divination tactic that would be used much, much, much later? Contemporary to the Pilgang in the south, we have the Pingdoshan. And they cultivated rice and left behind some very distinctive cord-marked pottery. And the remains of their settlement at Bashidang in Hunan was one of the first to have a defensive wall. Big deal, defensive walls. There is evidence of 8 distinctive, at least, Neolithic groups that existed between 5000 and 3000 BC. They individually developed different characteristics, and we can identify different parts of them as parts of Chinese culture. And they begin to interact over time, the way you do. You're looking to trade. Humans were social people. There's an increasing degree of ideas being spread between North and South. These cultural characteristics are being shared and traded. That doesn't mean that they are completely giving up their own individual characteristics as we go. It's just that maybe they're seeing something like, oh, their pottery's cool, we're gonna make this type of pottery, or oh, they're doing this with jade, we should make this with jade, or even like they're doing this with their burial practices, but we're doing this with our burial practices. But the idea is everyone is still getting buried with, if they're socially elite, a certain amount of grave goods. And then eventually that's gonna move into, we're moving away from a shamanistic religious culture into an ancestor worshiping religious culture. So the ideas are a mingling. Some examples of this, just to have some out there. The Hongshan culture of the Northeast produced these jade pendants, bracelets, earrings, and ritual objects such as axe heads and blades. Jade work was becoming increasingly common throughout China. There are several different Neolithic cultures that kind of see jade maybe somewhere else, and then they start doing something with jade. I mean, what is China known for but some beautiful jade work? Then we have the Daoankou sites, which predate the Longshan, who we're going to get to in a little bit. They would come to migrate into that same Central Plains region that we've been talking about. And they used an early script that shows some similarity between what the Shang would use later. So that would imply that Chinese handwriting, or the very beginnings of Chinese writing, might have originated kind of over towards the coast and then made its way inward with the Longshan. The Longshan who kind of take over from this group, the Yangshao, who is contemporaneous to all of this. They used an early script. The Liangzhu people of the Yangtze River Delta in the southwest made jade objects, they made silk and ivory and lacquered pottery, and they had an extremely stratified society, which we can kind of see evidence of from their grave goods. If you were an elite person, you were probably buried with the good grave goods, and then if you were poor, it was probably just some plain and simple pottery. And this stratified society is super common in China as we go on. The black lacquered pottery of these people is also very similar to pottery that's going to be produced by the Longshan people of the Central Plains when they get up there. The 8 are going to evolve into 5, with the one who's contemporaneous to the ones that I've just mentioned, the Yangshao. They were around 5000 BC, and they were centered on the Wei River, which is the largest tributary into the Yellow River. For Neolithic groups, we have the most evidence for the Yangshao people, and later for the Longshan, who lived in this kind of similar area. The reason for this abundance of information is because archaeologists have specifically excavated at their sites more often than others looking for Neolithic remains. The reason they have excavated more often there is because they are looking for evidence that the Yangshao, the Longshan, and the Xia are in this region, and that they are, in fact, the precursor to what we think of as Chinese culture. And I don't want to underplay this. The Yangshao and the Longshan and the Central Plains, it is the location where strong central states first emerge in China. But I do want to emphasize that there were many Neolithic cultures, and they have left no trace, or they just haven't been found yet because there hasn't been as much interest in looking for them. The Yangshao had interaction with other groups. such as the Hongshan, the Dawankou, and the Lingzhou. And through trade that would have facilitated an exchange of ideas over the course of 2,000 to 3,000 years, which is a long time. So we're not talking about some sort of military exchange of information. We're just talking about for a very long time, there were these Neolithic tribes. They were probably trading with each other. We have evidence that they were trading with each other. And so those ideas got shared. The Yangshao are perhaps descended from the Pyongyang farmers, and they created kind of red pottery. They also produced silk. They were one of the first cultures to create pottery and utensils using a lacquering technique. There are more than 1,000 sites for Yangshao people, and they had populations of, say, about 600 at each site. They had semi-subterranean houses and had dug storage pits for their grain. They domesticated dogs and pigs, say, at about 5,000 BC, and then sheep and cattle at about 3,000 BC. The Yangshao economy was dominated by millet. It provided more than half of their caloric intake. The rest was supplemented by hunting and gathering, fishing. They cultivated hemp and raised silkworms. It is amazing how quickly the Chinese figured out the silkworm. Who figured out if you boil a moth cocoon and then if you take it apart, it creates this really great fiber? It's wild to me. Humans are crazy what they come up with. Silk is a great innovation. It's amazing they found out about it. Their tools include stone and wood, agricultural implements, stone chisels, millstones, and stone and pottery spindles. And they also had eyed bone needles. And then the earliest known bronze artifact from the Chinese region was a knife that was found in this region. Bronze was a highly valued object that's made by adding molten copper to tin. The alloy is harder than the sum of its parts, and it creates some very sharp and durable items. Early bronze was used to create mostly ceremonial vessels, and most of what came from this kind of ancient period comes from what would be the Xia period. So the Yangshao, while we do have evidence of bronze, it does not appear that bronze was a significant part of their story. The Yangshao people practiced slash and burn agriculture, meaning they had to move villages whenever the soil started to decline in fertility, and then they would come back and probably rebuild on some of the same sites. This has caused some trouble for archaeologists. They did not have a long life expectancy. So we're talking 73% of remains that we have a record of were 40 or younger. They buried their dead really carefully and with ceremony. They had reverence for a select member of their dead, which would imply kind of the beginning of ancestor worship. And they probably practiced a shamanistic or animal worshiping religion. Judging from the graves and the sizes of buildings, at first they were a very egalitarian community, relatively equal, but then about mid-Yangshao, say 4,000 BC, it started to become a more stratified community with bigger homes or better grave goods going to richer and wealthier individuals. So following the Yangshao, we have the Longshan, and they were a broadly distributed culture that's kind of the basis for the first strong states in the Central Plains region. They had bronze weapons, they had a written language, they had a class structure, and it kind of places them at the start of what we think of as a Chinese history. The Longshan had unpainted gray and then later black pottery that was lacquered, and they made small copper objects. They had a potter's wheel, and they had rammed earth technology. So rammed earth walls are really interesting. They come from you build sort of a casing of two wooden structures, and then you pour dirt in, and then you hit it really hard with a bunch of stones, or you have a bunch of people there hitting it with stones, and then it gets really compacted down and very, very hard, and then you keep building and building and building on top of that, and then once it's all the height you want and compacted enough, you remove the wooden mold, and then what you have left is a compacted rammed earth wall. It creates a really relatively very strong wall for the time with, you're not using as many resources like trying to go get stones, you don't have to do mortar, you don't have to bake clay. So it's a pretty clever way to handle your wall needs for the time. And then what you also have is some very, very, very early remains that the Great Wall of China was made in this sort of rammed earth fashion. And then another aspect that we get are rammed earth foundations. So that's going to be where they, instead of, how we would pour concrete to create a really hard and flat foundation, they would level an area, and then they would do the rammed earth practice to create a really flat, hard foundation surface. Found in some of these rammed earth walls are some human remains that would be indicative of human sacrifice. Lots of ancient cultures did practice human sacrifice. I don't think I mentioned it in the Egyptian video, but there's some evidence of human sacrifice for them in the first and second dynasties. Gross, but a common enough practice. What we should take from the practice of human sacrifice and from these moats and rammed earth walls is that we are dealing with a more warlike people. Probably there were a lot of external threats that they had to contend with. This was how they dealt with it, through human sacrifice, presumably to some sort of shamanistic ritual type person or to the ancestors. And then you're going to have moats and walls and probably armies. So the Liangshan appear to be a brutal and more warlike people than the Yangshao. And probably as a result of having greater wealth, they needed to be more organized. And so they defended their settlements from nomadic peoples and smaller states. The decline of the Yangshao and the rise of the Liangshan may have been due to environmental changes. So the climate is going to gradually get cooler and drier as we go from 3000 to 1000 BC. And this would notably have required a lot more agricultural community cohesion. You're going to need more canals, you're going to need more dikes, you're going to need the walls. The North is just going to notably need to have more community cohesion in order to build. The Liangshan spread across the Central Plains over the course of 1,000 or so years, and they do not represent an invasion on the Yangshao people. They represent more of just, it took a long time, we're having some social cohesion, and eventually they sort of just absorbed the Yangshao. Community health deteriorated during the Liangshan, and they were shorter and had more dental problems and lacked iron. They had anemia. And it's funny, this was from an improvement in technology. So as their pottery got better and better, they were able to cook their millet for longer and longer. Who doesn't want soft millet? But with the increased cooking times, it also meant that the iron got leached out of the millet, and so they got anemia. They were also probably more reliant on fattier domesticated animals such as cows and pigs than they were on hunting game. The Liangshan period began a period of higher population density with settlements surrounded by moats, the rammed earth walls, and that was becoming more and more common. Warfare was becoming a more common occurrence, and the Liangshan communities had public buildings, palaces, roads, drainage systems. So all these innovations that would require the mobilization of large numbers of people to build them. And how do you mobilize a large number of people? The answer is through some form of administrative state or a strong chiefdom that's beginning to look more and more like a king. Liangshan communities traded with their neighbors, and we can see a real spread of Liangshan culture, but the regions still did have their distinct cultures despite that spread. But certain cultures did come together into something that we would recognize probably as Chinese, and that's square-shaped symbols, clan organization, pottery styles such as the tripod ding or the round foot dua, and they all coalesced into what we see as early Chinese. Networks of the Liangshan communities coalesced into the first strong Chinese centralized state. So why was it the Central Plains, as opposed to all of these other Neolithic cultures, why is it that they emerged as the first real strong state? Why the North instead of the South? And I think it really has something to do with community organization. The North had a lot of pressures on it to organize. So because they have the grasslands up north, they have these nomadic raiders coming down to them, they have to build the walls, they have to build the moats, they have to be able to defend themselves. That requires community organization. Then the weather changes. It gets a lot drier. It's not as moist. In order for their crops to survive, they have to get dikes, they have to get canals. So that requires community organization. As a community gets more and more organized, it means that it's able to mobilize and expand its territory. The requirement of the region was for organized community, which meant the Central Plains took on a central role in the dynastic system. And now we're going to talk about the Xia. So increased wealth led to more hostile attention, most likely, and organized physical defenses. In the second millennia, known as the 10,000 states, there was a time of warfare that does bear out in the archaeological record. In the dynastic tradition, the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou dynasties succeeded one another in a sequential fashion, falling when leaders were somehow immoral or they lost the mandate of heaven. But this narrative was written hundreds of years after the events that they're claiming to describe. Archaeological work has been carried out with the goal of finding the Xia, and there's evidence at Erleto, a site that dates from 1900 to 1500, so exactly when we would expect the Xia to historically exist. It has bronze artifacts, it has 2 palaces, and it was a large and well-planned city. The majority of Chinese archaeologists do accept that Erleto was the base of the Xia power. This evidence would be the first extensive and politically complex society in China, and they used bronze ritual objects, and they abandoned, we think, shamanistic worship and fully moved into ancestor worship. And even to a certain extent, royal ancestor worship. So there's that kind of like, there's an emperor, king type person. But there are no records from the Xia. So the Shang wrote about the Xia, but we don't have anything from the Xia specifically that is written. How extensive their territory was, if this really was the Xia, we don't know. Most archaeologists would say that the linear narrative, at the very least, that we've been given of the Xia, the Shang, the Zhou, probably isn't quite right. Probably what we have is the Xia kind of existing as this central state with the Shang to the east and the Zhou to the west. And then what happened as the Xia weakened, the Shang probably took their territory, and as the Shang weakened, the Zhou probably took their territory. So they're probably overlapping in time and territory, and eventually the mandate heaven itself, this linear succession of timeline, was probably an invention of the Zhou, who wanted to justify a rule over this whole feudal area which had not existed before. We will get back to the Shang and the Zhou, as I've said, when we cover our civilizations from 2000 BC on to say about 1000 BC. But till then, this is where we're going to leave our Chinese story. It is at the cusp of the dynastic system, but still very recognizably Chinese. Thank you so much for watching this video, and please like it and then subscribe to my channel if you would like more history content. I'll see you next time. Bye.